With all the recent buzz around the Netflix animated series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, I felt it was about time I looked back, discussed and reviewed the original 2010 Scott Pilgrim video game. What with the game having quite an interesting history and legacy, then there's also my rather complex relationship with the title to boot. So welcome to this randomised gaming video. My name is Random Gamer Riven, the editor, and right now I also have a winter cold as I record this, so apologies if my voice sounds a little bit croaky. It's not hard to notice that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is clearly a love letter to the old 80s and 90s scrolling beat-em-ups, which were hugely popular in the arcades back in the day. Putting on my designer hat, it's fairly clear to see this game draws elements from a huge range of titles from the genre. But the most important ones are Konami's range of licensed scrolling beat-em-ups like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade games and Technos' Japan Kunio-kun series. While Konami's licensed run is very well known and includes the Simpsons and X-Men arcades in it as well, the Kunio-kun series is not, and only in recent years has it gained a lot more popularity. The first game in this series, which helped lay the groundwork for all modern scrolling beat-em-ups, is the arcade game Nekketsu Koha Kunio-kun, better known to you and me as simply Renegade. While the original Japanese arcade version saw high school students knocking 7 bells out of each other, the Western version changed many of the graphics to look more like gang members, and many of the new designs seem to have been inspired by the 1979 film The Warriors, which in turn is likely one of the many films that helped inspire the genre in the first place. As for the Kunio-kun series, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, mostly draws from the Famicom title Downtown Nekketsu Story and its many follow-up games. Downtown Nekketsu Story is better known to you and me as River City Ransom in America or Street Gangs here in Europe. These days the series goes by the name River City in all regions outside of Japan. But River City Ransom took the stage format of most scrolling beat-em-ups and threw it out of the window. Instead, it went open world and added in a permanent upgrade system that saw you powering up your character by eating various food items, hugely revamping the format in a direction more games in the genre should have taken their design. How this all comes into play into the game adaptation of Scott Pilgrim is that the game itself takes the stage designs and bosses from Konami's titles, whereas the upgrade system is lifted straight out of River City Ransom, and the world map also allows you to replay and revisit any cleared stages at any point. While it isn't truly open world as River City, you will be re-exploring many a stage you've already cleared to either farm gold or to visit the shops in the first high street to buy the various upgrades to power up your character. Now, I could go on at length about the scrolling beat-em-up genre and the franchise I just mentioned because I'm a huge fan of it, but the key takeaway here about the games is that after the late 1980s the genre was largely ignored by developers and publishers for more profitable ones. While the genre still had plenty of fans, and I always enjoyed a good strolling beat-em-up, they just weren't being made. During the early 2000s there was very few made at all. Spike Out Battle Street by Sega, Final Fight Streetwise from Capcom and Namco's Urban Reign are some of the very few released, and none of them would make my top 50 scrolling beat-em-up list either, if you catch my drift. It wasn't until Xbox Live Arcade arrived and we saw re-releases of the 1989 Turtles arcade game and Double Dragon that the genre started to really return to consoles and 2D. In 2008, the Behemoth released Castle Crashers, which showed just how great the genre could look on modern consoles. Then in August 2010, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, would arrive alongside the feature film. Sadly, however, the feature film ended up flopping at the box office. While I never liked the film myself, I did end up really enjoying the game after a bit of a rocky start with it. From the offset, it's clear it was developed by a team that had a lot of respect for the genre, At the same time, it still felt like they were a little inexperienced with it, but not totally, as this wasn't Ubisoft's Montreal's first attempt at making a scrolling beat-em-up, as back in 2007 many of the team behind Scott Pilgrim, the game, made TMNT, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, on the Game Boy Advanced, which was a decent stab at bringing the genre to the GBA. While I wouldn't say it was the best turtle scrolling beat-em-up, it was a very good game in its own right. Ironically, it was a vastly superior game to the other tie-in titles based on the same film for Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable, also made by Ubisoft. To me, this is an important example of good development direction. The GBA team clearly knew the style of game they wanted to make for the platform and had a lot of passion for it, whereas the PSP game is a fairly generic 3D action platformer for the era that just isn't very good and doesn't look like it had a clear design vision behind it either. There is a but, however, as with it being 2007 when it was released, most gamers had moved away from the GBA, meaning a lot of people missed out on this one. If you were lucky enough to play this one, then you'll be able to see a lot of parallels with it and Scott Pilgrim the game, as many of the gameplay mechanics were directly reused and revised for it. Scott Pilgrim itself is a manga/graphics novel created by Brian Lee O'Malley, and first released in 2004. I would describe it as a coming-of-age story following the rather troubled love life of a young adult and the mistakes he makes. It is a slightly surreal version of the modern world and is full of pop culture references from films to games, featuring a rather wacky cast of people who are all a bit larger than life. And the story is very much a throwback to the late 90s and early 2000s when it was written. The story sees Scott Pilgrim having to defeat the 7 evil ex-boyfriends of his current love, Ramona Flowers, to win her heart. The plot itself is very silly and is perfect for a scrolling beat-em-up adaptation. In 2010, when the game released, Scott Pilgrim was still pretty niche. In fact, if it wasn't for one of my fellow video game co-workers going on about the books at the time, I might have skipped over it on the Xbox 360. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is what I like to call a modern retro game. It tries to blend both modern and retro design together. From the moment you first turn on the game, you are greeted with the art of Brian Lee O'Malley, Scott Pilgrim, designed by gaming artist Paul Robertson, which gives O'Malley's characters almost a Japanese chibi-like look with their somewhat oversized heads. The game is everything you'd expect from a comic book adaptation: bright, bold, colourful and very distinctive. All the 2D characters and animation are beautifully drawn here, and there is a huge attention to detail so that everything matches the original books as closely as possible. Each of the stages also have a clear look and theme from one another, from the snowy Toronto streets of the first stage, which you'll be revisiting a lot to spend hard-earned cash, the Halloween party from stage 5 that has you racing up a fire escape to reach the roof, to the stage 4 battle inside of and on top of a bus that also sees it get chopped in half. There's even a few hidden doors into Subspace Highway that allow you to skip certain sections. This type of level variation is what made the Konami scrolling beat-em-ups work so well back in the day, as each level felt different from the previous one, as without it the genre gets very repetitive very quickly. It's a pitfall many developers have a nasty habit of falling into when making scrolling beat-em-ups, but fortunately the staff at Ubisoft Montreal didn't, and after they left Ubisoft to form their own studio Tribute Games, they got even better at it. You really can't fault the art or visual design of the game. The only thing I would say is I wish maybe it had embraced the comic book origins a little bit more and paid homage to that. Games like the 1995 Sega Mega Drive title Comic Zone had the hero moving between the comic panels, and it's just a fantastic look. It's a shame very few games have since done anything similar. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, I have a love-hate relationship with this game. As discussed earlier, this is a blend of a few scrolling beat-em-ups from across the ages. Trouble is, they don't mix that well here for a couple of reasons. But let's start with the positives. Like the old Konami games, it allows 4 players at once, and the game had 7 playable characters in total. The original release featured Scott Pilgrim, Kim Pine, Stephen Stills, Ramona Flowers, with the negative Scott character unlocking after beating the game with the other 4, while Knives Chow's and Wallace Wells were added with their respective DLCs. The complete edition includes all the characters from the get-go. Now, if you ask me, any game where you can play with 3 players on the same couch gets my vote, and to be honest, I widely regard the lack of split-screen/couch co-op support in many modern games as just laziness on behalf of developers chasing a quick buck, as they don't want to add in that type of couch co-op multiplayer support. The combat and collision is very well done. I never felt like you have any duff hitboxes, attacks connect where they should, and there are plenty of items and weapons to use in combat on each stage. All the bosses have clear attack patterns and windows, and it never felt like the player is at a deliberate disadvantage at any point from the CPU. You can call in a special striker to assist you in battle, and the combo system allows you to rack up some huge chains on enemies. As you level up, you learn new moves, allowing you to chain combos in new ways and increase your fighting repertoire, allowing for new tricks and tactics. There's even a special 4-player hidden team attack. Where things don't go so well is the pacing and balancing. I suspect this was done to try and stop players finishing the game too quickly, but the upgrade system hugely slows down the pacing of the game and takes a lot of the fun out of it, as it acts largely as a gating system, forcing players to backtrack and farm gold in order to get stronger, as later enemies turn into sponges and are able to absorb huge amounts of damage. If you're crazy enough to even attempt Supreme Master without upgrade, be prepared for hour-long boss fights where you can't even take a hit, which just isn't fun. The reason the upgrade system works so well in River City Ransom is the player is free to explore the open world streets of the city as they please, and the game is designed to have short street sections, which you can move back and forth between very quickly to reach the shops. Applying an upgrade system to a conventional level structure means players are locked into long stages, and if you find you are under-leveled on one, then you are in for a long and unfun slog that the player won't enjoy and will most likely lose all their lives and forced to backtrack and replay the previous stage again, which is a bit disheartening as you get so far, get killed off and then we're going to have to replay the previous stage to progress. When I originally played through the game, I did so on Supreme Master and I really didn't enjoy it at the time. I beat the game with Scott and then put it on the back burner as a result. The harder difficulty settings are somewhat poorly balanced, as all it does is just up the health of enemies for the most part. This is a common and quick, but very bad way of increasing the difficulty, and developers really need to stop doing this. What you should be doing is adding in new enemies and lots more enemies, having the player face off against tougher enemies earlier on, and giving them new moves and attacks to deal with the players. Sadly, games rarely do this, largely due to the amount of work involved, but it makes for a more interesting challenge and a more enjoyable game on the harder difficulty settings, and one that never feels unfair. And this is one feature the original Turtles arcade did, as every time you beat a level without dying, it would increase the difficulty. Enemy damage remained the same, but it increased the number of enemies on screen, and this increased stage after stage until you reached the highest difficulty setting, which then had you facing off against hordes of foot soldiers. In short, it would increase or decrease the settings depending on how the player was doing, and this type of dynamic difficulty is really good stuff. It wasn't until I was replaying Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game a few years later when I really started to enjoy it. Firstly, the game is far better from the get-go if you just max out your character in the first stages on Supreme Master. This can be done via the coin cheat, and this sets the game more up like the Konami titles of old, and I found it far more enjoyable way to play the game. However, the more I played it, the more I liked it as a scrolling beat-em-up. Yes, it's an uneasy mix of gameplay elements, but given a sequel, I think the problems with it could be addressed easily, either by going down the Capcom Dungeons & Dragons route of branching stages, or by doing a proper take on the River City games. There were a few extra modes and some got added via the DLC, but none of them really grabbed me for more than a few minutes. The online mode was years too late, and Wallace Wells was an awful character as he was a head swap and reskin of Stephen Stills. The online was very hit and miss connection wise, and the game was far better in offline co-op. The soundtrack from Anamanaguchi was always a little off key in places I felt. There are some good tracks in there, but a few early ones just have the pitch too high at certain points, which makes the chiptune music in place a little unpleasant to listen to. It's a classic error I see with a lot of modern chiptune sound makers. The opening intro track for me just doesn't hit the right note, but I did enjoy many of the later tracks such as the credit theme and the Twin Dragon music track. And just to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, but I did know a few of my friends who absolutely loved the music, every track in it, so there is a little element of personal taste here as well. One thing I do want to point out was that the game was a license deal between Universal and Ubisoft. Quite why, I don't know. I can only assume Universal may have bought the rights to any Scott Pilgrim game when they made the film, as had Ubisoft made the game deal directly with Brian Lee O'Malley, then it would be very doubtful the game would have ever been delisted way back in 2014. The studio closed on Monday, credited as developing the game, appears to be little more than a rights arm for Universal, and the work for the game was done by Ubisoft, hence the Universal logo on starting the game. Anna Managuchi did the music as work for hire, and having spoken to them in the past, I learned they don't have any rights to the soundtrack they did for the game. Anna Managuchi were incorrectly blamed by some websites as the reason for the original delisting, which they had nothing to do with, but quite a few idiots believed this and sent some very unpleasant messages on social media to them. It goes without saying, Universal and Ubisoft are the main rights holders for the game, and the original delisting would have been a rights issue between them. Keep in mind that even the newer PlayStation, Xbox, Switch and PC Complete Edition of the game will be delisted at some point, so this is not a game you should sit on if you want to play it. Buy it as soon as possible. It's also fair to say the more people that buy it, the less chance it will be delisted. Sadly, while the original development team weren't involved with the newer port, most of the team left Ubisoft to form the excellent studio Tribute Games. So this means that the newer re-release has no new content whatsoever, it's just literally the original Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 game bundled in one pack with the DLC included from the get-go. So to answer the video's somewhat clickbait title, and yes, sorry about that, but yes, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, remains a great game despite the flaws, and it is well worth playing again even now over 10 years after release. And you know what, it's still going to be a great game to play 20 and even 30 years later. Just don't jump into Supreme Master Mode on your first playthrough. Fans of the genre and gamers who want something that is a reminder of the old arcade game should give it a whirl today. Are there better scrolling beat-em-ups available to buy? Yes, of course. In fact, Tribute Games' own Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge shows that the team behind the 2007 TMNT GBA game and Scott Pilgrim really did learn from their mistakes and produce something that is really first class. It is a fantastic and phenomenal game. In fact, I'm going to suggest you pick up Shredder's Revenge or another game from Tribute Games to support the now independent team behind Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. As with games like Shredder's Revenge, Mercenary Kings Reloaded Edition, Panzer Paladin and Flint Hook in their portfolio, you really can't go wrong with a title from Tribute Games. It's clear the team behind Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, really cared about what they were making, as there are so many subtle nods to the original books and countless video games, from the Pac-Man and Ghosts magnets on the fridge in Stage 5 to the hero of the NES game Clash at Demon Head called Billy Big Bang Blitz making a cheeky appearance in the background. Fans will note the name reference too. Finally, I should say a thank you to Scott Pilgrim's author Brian Lee O'Malley for the original story and for the team behind the game. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride. It's a game that, despite my original misgivings, has grown on me over the years. And because I played the game, I ended up buying the later hardback full colour versions of the original books, and they were a really good read, which goes to show if you adapt the source material right, it will draw people back to the original format, which is true of the new Netflix TV series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which has certainly boosted the range of Scott Pilgrim. Will we see another Scott Pilgrim game? Well, I don't know, but if it does happen, I want to see it developed by Tribute Games. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will wrap this review. But as always, if you enjoy our content here at Randomised Gaming, hit that like button and subscribe button. Hit the bell button if you want to stay up to date with all our content releases. And you can also follow us on Twitch and support us on Ko-fi.